Like to honor 3 more people this afternoon as a way to say thank you. If I can call on Sunita Vyas, she'll be presenting these plaques. And we want to honor Kala Narayan, Gulsharan Kanda, Serene Mundani. She is not here. Vijay Shastri will present this award, and since Serene is not here, accepting on her behalf, Chaitanya Desai.
Why you mad? Fix your face. Ain't my fault they all be jacking. Keep up. Players only. Come on. Put your head to toe so clear. Look out.
And also presenting Hema Bhatt.
I cannot preach. I cannot preach. I gotta show them how I can get it in. First, take your sip. Do your dip. Spend your money like money ain't shit.
Next up, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Wendy Cukier, the founder and academic director of Diversity Institute at the Ryerson University. Now, she'll be speaking about the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub. It'll serve as a one-stop source of knowledge, data, and best practices for female entrepreneurs. The hub will deliver a number of activities intended to support the advancement of women from diverse backgrounds throughout the innovation ecosystem. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cukier.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really a thrill to be here, and I'm sorry I wasn't here for the whole day, but the Collision Conference is downtown Toronto, so I've been going back and forth, but I did catch the last panel, and there are a lot of lessons and experiences that were shared that are consistent. It's okay, I'm a teacher. My students never pay attention either. You just keep talking, and eventually they'll sit down because they know there's an exam at the end. Did everyone know that? What I was saying was I thought the last panel was very interesting and really illustrated many of the points that we're going to be talking about. And I'm going to try to be brief. It's always hard because I'm used to talking in 3-hour blocks, but I just wanted to give you some of the highlights of the Women Entrepreneurship Hub, but also to talk a little bit about women entrepreneurship in Canada and what we know about the opportunities, but also the barriers. So one of the things that I think is super important is to really make sure that we're clear about what entrepreneurs are, to understand a little bit about the experience of women, particularly diverse women, what it means to build an inclusive innovation ecosystem, and then a little bit about what the Diversity Institute is doing. And I'm really delighted that I was invited to join the conversation, because one of the things that we need to do is really build the networks of women across the country and around the world. So, one of the things that's very important is to think about what an entrepreneur is, because often the way in which entrepreneurship is defined really has the result of excluding women. It's basically someone who creates new combinations, and those can be enterprises, products or services that are for profit, or those that are to advance social goods. There's nothing in the notion of entrepreneur that has specific connections to the for-profit sector, and that becomes really important when you want to think about social enterprises, for example, that may, like Num Num, which combines earning money with doing good. And when we look at some of the world's problems, it's important to promote doing both. So, and it's interesting because I haven't spent a lot of time in India. I've been there a couple of times, but one of the things that always really impressed me was that in India, when they talk about entrepreneurship, when they talk about innovation, They include the full range of activities. If you think about Tata, for example, which is a very, very interesting company to me, it's not a company, it's a charity, right? It's a very unusual, business model in the Western world, but in India, the notion of combining social good with profit is very well embedded in the society, and I think that's something that we can really learn from. The other reason why thinking about the definitions is important is usually in a room this big, if you said, name 3 entrepreneurs, people would say Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, and Steve Jobs maybe, some combination. They wouldn't talk about Kylie Jenner. Remember Kylie was a billionaire at the age of 20? They wouldn't talk about Oprah Winfrey, and they wouldn't talk about people who are in the food businesses or creative industries or the full range of activities that entrepreneurs engage in. There's a really strong association, at least in North America, between entrepreneurship, men, and technology. And that really only accounts for a very small fraction of entrepreneurs in North America. But if you look at where the money goes for programming, for support, for research, for investments, it's very concentrated in those areas, particularly science, technology, engineering, and math. So if you look at the government programs, and it's wonderful that Minister Ng, who spoke to you earlier, has set aside $2 billion to invest in women entrepreneurship. But if you compare that to all the money that's being invested by the government in entrepreneurship and innovation, it's really only a small fraction. And most of the other money, the money for the superclusters, the money through the National Research Council, the money through FedDev and Western Dev and those other big government funding agencies, most of that money is going to men. Because in large part of the way entrepreneurship is defined, and we heard the story this morning about how no one could get their head around in the banks or I guess in the government, around the idea of a business that was a mobile dental hygienist, right? I, on the other hand, am thinking, when can she come to my house, because I have no time to go get my teeth cleaned. You know, I want a mobile dog washer, I want a mobile dental hygienist, I want my food delivered. Like, I thought it was brilliant, right? But because of the way in which entrepreneurship has been constructed, because of the way in which many of our institutions have defined their selection criteria and their financing criteria, a lot of really good ideas get missed, and a lot of them, unfortunately, are ideas that women have. And you combine that with the fact that women often have fewer material assets that are often required to finance businesses, and often are a little bit more risk adverse in terms of asking for money, you can see why there are problems. Does that make sense? So we have to think about the definition. And when we look at women entrepreneurs in Canada, it's interesting because if you define women entrepreneurs as those who have employees, it's about 13%. But if you look at self-employment, it's more like 30%. And we have to recognize that women will sometimes pursue entrepreneurship because they want the flexibility. Let's face it, we're still doing the bulk of the work when it comes to raising children and so on and so forth. But lots of women entrepreneurs are driven by exactly the same things that drive men forward. We also know that women account for a larger percentage of new businesses that are being created, but their businesses tend to be smaller, and they tend to be less likely to export. Now, the exception there is when we look at immigrant women, right? Because one of the competitive advantages or superpowers lots of immigrant women entrepreneurs have is they know international markets. And it's really important to recognize the strength and the value of international experience. You know, everybody talks about how important Canadian experience is, and of course it is, because you have to understand the local context. But international experience, when it comes to growing your business or helping someone else grow their business, can be really invaluable, particularly when you look at where the growth markets are around the world. And so we know that the other thing, and I mentioned that everybody associates entrepreneurship with technology, we also know it's true that women are underrepresented in North America in the STEM disciplines. So under 20% of computer science, engineering, and so on. And so it's not surprising they represent a small percentage of tech startups. But women are overrepresented in many growth areas, including services, food products, and consumer goods, which you heard about today. And as I said, many of the government programs and policies are skewed to favor traditional industries, resource extraction, manufacturing, and tech. And those are typically not the places we find women. So if you start to really think about the definition of entrepreneurship more broadly, if you start to include self-employment as well as companies that are incorporated that have employees, if you include creative industries and services and so on, suddenly you see far more women. And as I said, it is true that many women choose entrepreneurship because it works with their multiple responsibilities, which can include childcare, but also parental care, et cetera, But the differences are not that great between men and women in terms of the motivations for choosing entrepreneurship. The other thing that we know, and some of this was referenced in the earlier discussions, is we know that aspirations are shaped by what you see around you. And if all of the images of entrepreneurs and all the stories of entrepreneurs are white men from Silicon Valley, you know, we don't really have the role models that even young boys have to advance entrepreneurship. Girls, at least in North America, are more conditioned to be obedient and follow the rules and so on and so forth, and they're less encouraged to take chances and to start businesses. So we really have to think about those forces. One of the strongest predictors of whether someone will be an entrepreneur is whether or not their parents were entrepreneurs, right? So if your parents owned a restaurant, if your parents owned a farm, if your parents were insurance brokers, real estate agents, or high-tech billionaires, there's a much higher probability that you will be an entrepreneur. And that's partly because it becomes embedded in the family culture. Instead of thinking about working for a large organization or government, people think about starting their own business at a young age. So we really have to try to grapple with some of those social forces. We also have to think about the way in which entrepreneurship and business is taught. I'm in the entrepreneurship school at Ryerson, which is one of the biggest in the country. And until a few years ago, most of the faculty in that department were men, and most of the students were men, right? And that was just the way it was. And what we found at Ryerson was when we started reframing entrepreneurship as social innovation, when we started creating opportunities for kids to solve global problems, world hunger, settle Syrian refugees, address climate change, deal with food security in the far north, suddenly the women appeared, right? So if you would call a meeting and say, we're all going to learn how to be tech entrepreneurs, you'd get the engineers and maybe some business students. If you called a meeting and said, we're going to learn how to be change makers, or we're going to learn how to solve global challenges, or we're going to learn how to feed the poor, promote world peace, save the whales, suddenly women would appear. And yet the characteristics and the processes that you go through in addressing social problems with social enterprises are identical to the processes and the characteristics you need to be successful in business. And I did a book a number of years ago called Innovation Nation, where we looked at high-tech entrepreneurs. And I concluded from that tech entrepreneurs had more in common with social activists and artists than they did CEOs of banks. For example, and I don't know if any of you know Desh Deshpande. He created Sycamore Networks. He was one of the people that we interviewed. And again, Desh is really interesting because he became a bazillionaire in the tech sector, but he's very well known for advancing social entrepreneurship because, again, he sees those things as being intimately connected. So the absence of role models, the lack of an orientation that is suited to women, the fact there are very few women teaching in entrepreneurship, those are all impediments. And similarly, we know that when women enter entrepreneurship, regardless of whether it's through formal or informal means, they often have less access to mentoring and sponsorship. Does everybody understand, what's the difference between mentoring and sponsorship? Does anybody know? A mentor is someone who gives you advice. A sponsor is someone who's out there fighting for you. And they're two really different things. We all need sponsors or champions. We don't just need people who are going to tell us what to do. We also know, and you know, I was the Vice President of Research and Innovation at Ryerson, and so I watched this, and it was plain as day. The processes that are in place, and there's tons of research to show this, whether intentional or unintentional, present barriers to women, in part because of those preferences that I mentioned earlier for tech startups and so on. Ruby's giving me the "you're almost out of time" sign, so I must hurry. But we also know that in the incubators and the accelerators that are being set up, and there's one, for example, going to be established in Brampton, often the processes that they have in place unintentionally present barriers to women and also to immigrants. So if you think about Dragon's Den, right? Dragon's Den is great theater. Dragon's Den is not a good way to find entrepreneurs. And that kind of adversarial, pitch and show that you can out-bully the judges, right? That appeals to a certain kind of person, typically men, and typically North American men. And it can be very alienating for lots of other cultures where deference or modesty or expertise are valued over showmanship. So there are a lot of things that are really embedded in our processes that we have to think about. And that's part of the reason why the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub is really focused on this idea of building an inclusive innovation ecosystem. So we're not just supporting the organizations that are explicitly designed to support women entrepreneurs. We're trying to get the banks, the venture capitalists, the universities, the incubators, everybody to apply a gender and diversity lens to what they're doing, to really think about what the barriers are that may be invisible to them in terms of their criteria, in terms of their processes, even in terms of the judges who are making the decision. If you don't have diversity at all levels, right? You're not going to get, if you don't have diversity in the inputs, you're not going to get diversity in in the outputs. And so we're trying to build a system that links all the pieces together, that provides support for people who are starting up, but also for scaling up. And it was really interesting to hear about some of the successes that people in the room have achieved, not just in starting businesses, but effectively in going global. And so in terms of dealing with these issues, as I said, you know, if you focus on science, technology, engineering, and math, this is kind of what you get. And if you think entrepreneur and you think male, this is what you're going to get. And yet we know that if you look at successful women in technology, particularly those who are CEOs of big tech firms, a very small percentage of them are actually computer scientists and engineers. Very often they've come up through marketing or law or something else. One of the dirty secrets, for example, at MIT, which is an engine of growth in the Boston area, is that more of the successful startups are led by business graduates than by engineers, because the business graduates are the ones who actually identify the opportunities and go find the engineers to build the stuff. With respect to the engineers in the room, engineers often make stuff where there's really no user, no market, but they do it because they can. And so if you start to rethink what the characteristics are of successful entrepreneurs, understanding problems, understanding markets, understanding how to build teams and so on, suddenly you'll find more women. And we've got, we've done a lot of work to try to address some of these barriers, and you know, if people are really interested in the details, I can go through them at some other point. But I think the key thing is looking at the individual, because organizations don't make decisions, people do. And so the choices that women make, the choices that people dealing with women make, all become fundamentally important. And addressing the bias that is often built into our own assessments of each other and ourselves becomes very, very important. So all I wanted to say about, we have too many hubs. Women Entrepreneurship Hub, no, that's not it. That's not it. Maybe we lost it. I was here to talk about the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, but my slide appears to have disappeared. And it really, there's a brochure outside you can refer to, but really the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub is designed to strengthen the ecosystem, to link together organizations that are serving women, whether they're women's organizations or not, and you understand the distinction between them, using evidence to really advance our approaches, because there's lots of talk, frankly, about women and diversity, but if you're not using the levers that drive change, if you're not looking at procurement, if you're not looking at where the money's being put, if you're not looking at who is being put out front as models of entrepreneurs, you're not actually going to make change. So we're very focused on trying to advance women and also recognizing that diverse women often face multiple barriers. We've done lots of research on immigrant entrepreneurs as well as women entrepreneurs, and we know that things have to change in order to level the playing field. And in doing so, we advance Canada's potential for both social and economic growth. So thank you very much.